Okay, so we are now at the top of the hour. So we have now started the recording, and I want to welcome everybody. So, hello, welcome to the Materials Concern Preparedness Leading into the Challenge webinar. I'm Laurie Freund with the Southeastern Wisconsin, or SUI Libraries. Assisting me is Jean Anderson with the South Central Library System, and we're glad to have you here. Our presenters are Megan Schliesman and Tessa Michaelson Schmidt of the Cooperative Children's Book Center located on the UW-Madison campus, and Teresa Schmidt, Public Library Administration Consultant with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction's Library Services. They will be discussing policies and procedures, what staff and board members should know, and where Wisconsin libraries can go to find more information and assistance when concern or materials concern or challenge arises. So please note the presenters will be taking questions, or you know what, I'll let them begin with their presentation. So go ahead and begin when you're ready.
Well, thank you, Lori. Thanks so much to you and SUI for hosting this workshop, inviting us to do it, and thank you to Jean for that backup support she's providing. We are all going to introduce ourselves and tell you a little bit more about ourselves in a moment, but first we want to really thank you for being here today. We know you are busy. We also know from the registration forms and reading through those and just from the conversations we've all had with librarians around Wisconsin that there's a lot of anxiety around this issue. And so what we also know is that you can't control what's going to happen in your library in terms of whether somebody's going to ask questions or challenge materials. But what you can control is your own level of preparation, and your commitment to spending time here today really underscores how serious you are about that. And that's a really, really great thing. And you should feel really good about this. So who are we? Well, my name is Megan Schliesman, and I am the Assistant Director at the Cooperative Children's Book Center, which is a library of the School of Education at UW-Madison. I also, in that role, manage our Intellectual Freedom Information Services. And one of the things I think I appreciate most about being in this position at the CCBC, where I get to talk to so many librarians across Wisconsin, both at the time of a challenge and as they're doing this kind of preparation work, is it really underscores for me how lucky communities around Wisconsin are to have librarians and people like you, to have you doing the work you are doing and being there on behalf of everyone in your communities.
Thank you for that, Megan. My name is Tessa Michaelson Schmidt, and I'm the director of the Cooperative Children's Book Center. And I have had the pleasure and honor of actually working with Megan in many different touch points at the CCBC when I was a student assisting with our Intellectual Freedom Information Service. And then throughout my career as a classroom teacher, school librarian, public librarian, public library administrator, and I have really just continued to learn and evolve about intellectual freedom information service, or intellectual freedom, sorry, in all of the different capacities in which it is part of our lives in Wisconsin in relation to books for kids. And so every time I come to a conversation about intellectual freedom issues, I do really think that importance of taking a beat and having gratitude for saying, yes, thank you for bringing that forward. Let's talk about it, whether it's with a colleague or in many of the situations I think we're fearful of, just starting with that. Let's talk about it. Thank you. This is why this dialogue, why we have this space, is to connect and go through this together.
Thanks, Tessa. And I'm Teresa Schmidt. I am a public library administration consultant with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction on the library services team. There are about 20 people on the library services team that cover all kinds of different areas, but I'm the only one that is an administration consultant. So I'm the person that you can reach out to when you have questions about state statutes, board operations, policies, and things like that. I'm relatively new to my position. I've been with the state for about 6 months, 7 months now. Before that, I worked mostly in very small libraries in the Northwoods. I was a director of the Mercer Public Library for about 16 years. And the thing that I've found really interesting about my position here with the state so far is that despite the fact that libraries are incredibly varied across the state, not just in our sizes, but the communities we serve and the services that we offer, even so, so many libraries have the same questions about the statutes, about how to apply their policies, about how to write policies. Doesn't matter if you're a large library or a small library. I get the same sorts of questions from all kinds of libraries around the state. So I always want to encourage people to reach out to me. Don't ever hesitate and feel like I should know this already, or it seems like we should have done this a long time ago. You'd be surprised at how many people are in the same boat on so many different topics. And that includes your collection development and management policies, which is one of the things we're going to talk about today. So I'm glad that you're all here. I'm glad you're interested in learning about how to be prepared for these issues.
So with that, I think we're going to turn our videos off so we can just focus on our slide content. I just want to talk through briefly how we hope to use our time today. As Lori had hinted at, I just wanted to go over a little bit of housekeeping in the sense that our entire slideshow presentation for you today and the content we prepared is really organized in response to the questions and concerns that you shared when registering for today's webinar. So while we won't be able to actively respond to every single item that were in those responses, we have really tried to organize this around some of the key factors that go into being prepared. At the end, if time allows, I will try to gather some of the things that might come up in the chat during the webinar. So don't hesitate if there was can you say more about that? Or wait, what about this issue? Can you mention that? I will be watching for those and bringing up to Teresa and Megan when we get to the very end. But in terms of the topics we're going to cover today, first, we really want to emphasize why policies and procedures are so important in this process. We're also then going to be moving into, well, what makes a really strong policy and procedures, and how can you check if yours is in a good position? And of course, we can't talk about intellectual freedom issues without talking about communication, and we'll emphasize a couple of different parties and some strategies to be thinking about. And in the end, we will conclude with a resource roundup. So relax and, just as Megan said, honor that you have set aside time to go through and think about these things today. You will have the slides, you will have all of the links and things that we are referencing as soon as the webinar is over. So don't feel like you need to write everything down. We have organized it so that hopefully you can just click and learn more from everything that we are sharing today. So let's get started with part one. Why are policies and procedures so important for selection and reconsideration?
And I'll just add that Teresa is going to get us going on part one with some key definitions.
Absolutely. So we will talk in great detail about some specific policies later on, but just so that we're all on the same page. Policies provide direction, guidance, rules for how the library carries out its work. Policies are developed by the board, and they need to be reviewed carefully and approved by the board. In most practical considerations, the library director or other library staff provide the board with some talking points or provide the board with a draft policy to look at, because most board members are not experienced in writing library policy. But the reason that the board approves them is because the board is given that authority in the statutes to administer or supervise the administration of the public library. And so that is the role of the board, to set policies that then guide the day-to-day actions of the staff. Procedures are those day-to-day actions. So just like you don't want your board micromanaging you on your desk work, you don't want them micromanaging the actual procedures that your staff are going to follow for certain things. So these are developed by the director and staff. They can sometimes be guidelines, sometimes they can be step-by-step directions for your staff to follow on certain topics, but they are things that are developed by the director and the staff, and they don't require board approval. But the procedures have to align with the policies that the board approved. A library is obligated to follow its policies and its procedures. So just because something is a procedure doesn't make it optional. It's just a different level of how those steps are developed. And thank you, Megan. So again, there's a lot of different ways to define some of these things, just so we're all on the same page today. This is the terminology we are using. Selection and collection development is talking about how materials get into your library collections. That includes not just purchases, but also donations and gifts. You should be applying the same standards to materials that you are accepting as gifts as you are to materials that you are purchasing. And then collection maintenance and management is both selection and weeding of your collections. And hopefully you have some, again, policies and procedures that guide your work in those areas.
So then we wanted to move on to look at some professional standards around all of this. So for collection and management, again, that's selection, and then that's going on to evaluation and weeding. You really want to make sure that those policies align selection, evaluation, and weeding to your library mission. On the one hand, that's really logical and seems obvious, but it's really important too because it helps prioritize how your library is spending its collections budget. And it just constantly reinforces that idea that you are building a collection and providing services to fulfill that mission. And then, of course, it provides guidelines and criteria for selection and weeding. And that's really critical to your staff when they're carrying out that huge job of selection and evaluation when it comes to making sense of the myriad choices they have. It gives them concrete means for evaluation, and it's also critical for underscoring for the public and your board the really serious job of curating and maintaining a library collection. Really reinforcing what we all know, and we want them to understand, which is that it is not and has never been a matter of anything goes. And then when we move on to reconsideration, again, having those policies and procedures in place and following them ensures that there's a consistent and thoughtful process for responding to a complaint. And it doesn't matter who is or where that complaint is coming from. That same process applies to everyone, whether it's a community member, whether it's the mayor, whether it's a donor, whether it's one of your trustees, or an organized group. And it also doesn't matter what the topic is about in terms of the concern, whatever the issue that is being raised, the process for responding to a concern or complaint about materials as outlined in those policies and procedures has to apply. And then, of course, we want them to align to the collection development criteria and guidelines. In other words, when somebody makes a complaint about material in your library, it's not like you're going to be evaluating those materials by new standards raised in the complaint. You're going to take what they have said in that complaint into consideration, but ultimately the job of the reconsideration process is to determine, does this book meet our selection criteria and guidelines? The consistency that comes in following these board-approved policies and procedures really helps guarantee that no individual or group and no single perspective is given favoritism. The least vocal and least visible members of your community have the same rights as the most visible and most vocal members of your community, and your library serves them all.
And while we're on the topic of rights, I think it's really important, especially when you're talking with your board members and your municipal board members, that we take a step back and we look at where these principles come from, because this is not something that those crazy people at the ALA invented or that we as librarians are trying to push on our communities. Wisconsin's Constitution, right in Article 1, in its Declaration of Rights says, every person may freely speak, write, and publish his sentiments on all subjects, being responsible for abuse of that right, and no laws shall be passed to restrain or abridge the liberty of speech or of the press. And the Wisconsin legislature has codified this in statute 43.001. Chapter 43 of our statutes is the chapter that deals with libraries. And this is a legislative declaration that the legislature recognizes the importance of free access to knowledge, the critical role of a diversity of ideas, and the role that libraries play in the democratic process. When your municipal board members or your library board members agree to become part of your municipal board or library board. They also affirm to uphold the Wisconsin Constitution and the laws of the state of Wisconsin. And intellectual freedom is baked right into those. That is true in most states in the United States. It's true in the United States Constitution as well. But I think it's important to remember, as you deal sometimes with people who may have conflicting interests to your library, who may be in positions to exert some authority, to keep in mind that this is the core of what our state is built around, and it is not your opinion, it is the legislature's opinion and the founding fathers of Wisconsin, if you will. And the role of the library board is also built into the statutes. The library board shall supervise the administration of the public library and shall appoint a librarian. And the library board may set reasonable regulations in order to render the library's use most beneficial to the greatest number. So that is not, I want to just point out, a sign that you should capitulate to the interests of the majority and overrun the rights of a minority group in your community. However, it does allow the library board to set regulations like, for example, lending policies, rules of patron behavior, things like that. Following your pre-established policies and procedures protects you because it gives you as a library employee a thing to point to say, our local elected officials have appointed our library board, and this is the policy that our library board has approved, and I am following it without prejudice and applying it evenly to anybody who comes to the library and has a question about our materials or resources. And we're not going to go into super great detail today about the process of writing a policy, but I just wanted to remind you that there are some resources available to you for that. Trustee Essentials, a handbook for public library trustees, has a chapter about developing essential library policies. And it talks about the 4 important points of legally defensible policies, which is that they must comply with statutes and case law. They have to be reasonable. They have to be clear. And they have to be applied without discrimination. So the question of course is, what do you do if you don't know if your policy meets those standards? Who can you reach out to? You still have resources there. If your library has an attorney or your municipality has an attorney, that should be a good resource for you. Your library system director or staff, they are mostly very well versed in writing and reading and understanding library policy, and they can help you with those as well. And I am here as well and I am happy to answer questions about policies. And if you ever have a need for that, my contact information will be in this presentation at the end again.
So now we're moving on to part 2. What are elements of strong policies and procedures? And as Teresa said, we're not going to get into how you actually write these, but what we are going to go over is what is ideal to have in them. Now, what we are going to lay out are best practices, what we'd love to see every library strive for. If your policy doesn't currently have all of these elements, you can think about them as things to work toward. Even if they aren't feasible in this very moment, they might be feasible a little bit down the road. Ultimately, knowing these best practices helps you and your board make informed choices when it comes to what your policies and procedures are going to say. I also want to add that we're about to get really into some details of what some of those best practices are. Not only will you have a copy of these slides to refer back to, so don't feel like you have to be writing everything down, but you will have one of the links we're providing is to a worksheet activity that we've developed to help you assess your own policies and procedures for these elements. So starting with things that a strong policy for collection management is going to include, starting with aligning the collection to the library's mission. And I talked a little bit about that earlier. Stating the importance of collecting and providing access to materials, providing diverse viewpoints, and reflecting the plurality of our society. And again, it's important to remember what Teresa just talked about, State Statute 43.001, which talks about free access to knowledge, information, and diversity of ideas. A strong policy will outline broad criteria for selection and will ideally affirm intellectual freedom in the Library Bill of Rights. Now, these are professional standards that help support the library's role in to serve everyone in your community. So they support the right of someone to go to the public library to access a copy of the Bible, as well as the Quran or Buddhist teaching, a book about the right to own a gun, as well as a book about the need for gun control. Those are just some examples of that broad idea of diverse viewpoints and the plurality of our society that all of these professional standards support.
Moving into a little bit more detail regarding policies and procedures for collection management. I just want to say, before you start looking at all of these tiny bullets or thinking about this as a checklist, just again, remember that resource that Megan mentioned, that we will have some activities that are in our resources that will help you do this either on your own or with your board, or perhaps in conversation with other colleagues. All of the bullet points here can be in a policy, but sometimes some of the details, such as who is responsible and or the criteria and resources for selection, they can be also laid out in procedures as well. So just be aware that it doesn't all have to be in this really detailed policy. Some of the things can be also clarified within the procedures. A few details that you might want to think about are the who and the how. For example, if you can indicate who is responsible for selection or evaluation and what terms or guidelines shape those decisions. Also, donations, gifts, and patron requests might not be on your radar when you think about collections, but they are really important to consider, especially in terms of being consistent and transparent with how things are handled. And really, as much clarity as you can provide in your policies and procedures for how you grow and manage your collection are going to help you feel more confident about responding transparently if a material is challenged. Similarly, regarding your reconsideration of library materials, these are a few things that you might want to consider or go back through with a little bit more of a comb to think about with your policies and procedures. Because again, it comes down to that who, how, and when. We often think of a challenge starting with the reconsideration form, but one thing we wanted to make sure to point out, or as I kind of said in my introduction, sometimes having that conversation can be extremely powerful. Acknowledging someone, sitting down, showing that active listening. So just don't underestimate or even exclude the potential for a resolution that can come from an informal one-on-one conversation. It doesn't have to go straight to the form. So really consider that pre-step of, let's sit down and talk about it. Tell me what your concerns are. The resolution might come from that. If, however, a request to reconsider is filed, it's important that there is clarity around the need for a separate request form for every item. I think some people have kind of gleaned this from big headlines of seeing what happens when a lot are challenged all at once, but just being really clear that a separate form is needed per item. Also, and this goes back to every slide that we've talked about so far, when a material is being challenged or considered, it needs to remain available and in circulation. So just considering the full access and that these are materials that should be available even when it's being reconsidered. So making sure that that is not a barrier or something being removed from access is really critical when you're going through something. Also, I think it's important, and we've had many conversations, as Megan had said, with libraries around the state, being really understanding that sometimes the people coming forward, we know the terms reconsideration, or we know the terms intellectual freedom or materials. That might not be how a member of your community is thinking about their concerns with a book or a DVD or whatever the item is. So just think about that in terms of expectations and thinking about it, not just in terms of the transparency of the process of how everything goes, but really being transparent and trying to think about things on the other side of what this form might look like. What are the words on there of what you're asking them to do? And while you might know the step when someone wants to express a concern is this form, and you might be thinking in your head step B, step C, moving on down the line, the patron might not. So really being clear of like what the expectations are in terms of the timeline or who does what, anything that you can lay that out will really help you feel more confident and make sure that you and your board and anyone else involved in this is handling things as consistently as possible. Yeah, and I think, yeah, Megan, it's on you.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about what a strong policy for reconsideration of library materials will not contain. It's not going to contain barriers to filing a request for reconsideration. And here's some examples of some barriers that we know some libraries have adopted really pragmatically in recent years, but it's so important to remember that we all embrace the principles of intellectual freedom. And part of those is that the right to question. And it's really important that we not say, well, the principles of intellectual freedom apply in our work, but not to people who are making use of our library, whether they're doing that from a distance or right from within our community. So it's just really, really important to keep that in mind. You know, what I always say is we don't want to look like we're sort of cherry picking what elements of intellectual freedom we want to uphold. We really need to uphold them all for everyone. And then we don't want a reconsideration policy that leaves decision-making at any stage up to a single individual. And I know, you know, some policies or procedures do have that informal conversation and often, or the initial review is done and the decision-making is in the hands, for example, of the director. We really encourage you to think beyond that single of individual. If it's a larger library, maybe it's the director and a small committee of staff. And in a larger or small library, it could be a director and a small subset of the board. And then the appeal process would go to the full board. This is so important because it protects the rights of patrons from a single person holding that much power or authority. It also protects any individual working at the library from bearing that responsibility alone. Pragmatically, however, it's really important to think about including language that acknowledges there are limits to the resources the library can devote to reconsideration requests at any given time. So Tessa talked before about time frame, that we hope your policies and procedures contain a time frame, but build some flexibility into how that's stated. So maybe it's that the library will make every effort to provide a decision within a certain number of days. And maybe it's about limiting the number of requests a single individual can submit within a specified time frame. So yes, you can do more requests for reconsideration, but it has to be after really we've had time to respond to the ones that have already been submitted. Again, I mentioned we have that review activity. This is going to really help you go through and take a look at your policies and procedures and see what they currently have and maybe what you might want to add to them. So some libraries use the same form for requests for reconsiderations, as well as displays, exhibits, and programmings. It's really important to know that all of this, well, we're going to talk more about that in a minute. What I want to talk more about is the individual elements that you might include on the request for reconsideration. And this is all really practical. This is probably something that is already on your request for reconsideration form. But we wanted to add that Tessa talked about this earlier, the importance of providing transparency. And we have in our What If questions and answers on intellectual freedom forum, we actually have sort of an example of how you can do this in one of our questions and responses called Updating the Request for Reconsideration. This provides an example of why you want to build in that transparency and how you might do it in a reconsideration form.
And I'll just,
go ahead.
could you go back to the last slide, Megan?
Yep.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in and say that I'm glad that Megan mentioned on the previous slide about not tying yourself down to a very strict timeline. Just from a practical standpoint, anytime you're writing a policy, you want to be as open and transparent as you can be in that policy, provide a clear procedure for how your library board is going to handle any issue. And I'm not suggesting that you attempt to delay response to any of these challenges based on anything that you might have written into your timeline that gives you that flexibility. But at the same time, you don't want challengers, in particular, maybe you have sort of a group that's got an adversarial mindset and they want to pick apart your policy. And if your policy said we're going to respond within 30 days and your board just can't get together within those 30 days, you don't want to give them sort of an in to creating a more difficult situation because you were unable to follow your policy. So that's why it's kind of important to have that flexibility built in there. Transparency and a clear process, absolutely, but don't tie yourself down in terms of timelines or specific, even naming specific members of a committee that may work on it, because what if one of those members is unavailable for some personal reason? So that's sort of a good reason to build that flexibility into these processes. Thanks, Megan.
So now is when I want to talk a little bit about the importance of other policies. So as we know, it's not just that materials can get challenged. Programs can get challenged. Whether or not a group is allowed to use your meeting room can get challenged. Exhibits, displays, and bulletin boards can all receive complaints. There's also issues around potential access to collections and circulation. So all of these policies really exist at the intersection of patron concerns, library operations, and intellectual freedom. So not only should all of these kinds of policies align to the library's mission, they shouldn't contradict one another. So we really hope that your library has policies that affirm intellectual freedom in the Library Bill of Rights. But in doing so, you need to make sure that you are not violating the principles outlined in that Library Bill of Rights in other policies. So one example of this is around access to collections. If you have a policy that is restricting access to certain types of materials or parts of the collection based on age, and you have affirmed the Library Bill of Rights in another dimension of your policies, you've now got two policies that contradict each other because limiting access to parts of a collection is in violation of the Library Bill of Rights. The last element we want to talk about is policies around patron behavior. This is particularly important to consider given the nature of some of the situations we've seen in recent years, because we want to always make sure that library staff feel safe in their workplace and that they should not be subjected to threatening patron behavior. So your patron behavior policy needs to address how the library is going to, shut that down, whether it's removing a patron for a single time or something beyond that. It's really important that you're thinking about those dimensions as you are creating your policies and procedures.
Now we're moving into part 3 of, as I mentioned, communication considerations. And I just want to acknowledge that your policies and procedures do communicate a lot about what's going on. And so this next section, we are going to kind of expand on that to really be thinking about critical dialogue that should be perhaps a focused conversation or just embedded in your ongoing conversation with different groups. And we're going to emphasize the trustees and the library board, staff or kind of internal conversations at your library, and then more of the external conversations with community members. And a link to right here on the slide is a different review activity that has been developed that will help you think about some of these important ongoing conversations.
So the library board is an interesting animal because you are bringing together a group of disparate people from the community. They've been appointed by your municipal leader, the mayor, the town chairman, whoever is the relevant person in your community. And sometimes you don't know what you're getting. Sometimes you do know what you're getting. The important thing for board members to know is first and foremost that as a board member, they have no individual authority. They only have authority as a member of the board. They can only take action at the board table along with all of their fellow board members. Some people, unfortunately, do have motivations to become a member of a library board in order to challenge things and make things difficult for library staff. For whatever reason, some valid, some maybe you may not consider valid, but everyone is entitled to their opinions about things. But the board member does not have any extra authority because they're a board member until they are sitting at the board table. Board members should all remember that the library serves the entire community. They should remember that they have sworn to uphold the Constitution of the state of Wisconsin and the statutes of the state of Wisconsin, which includes those principles we mentioned earlier about the importance of the diversity of ideas. And it is helpful during your board meetings if you can occasionally bring some of these topics up and remind your board how collections support your mission, how intellectual freedom strengthens your library's ability to fulfill that mission. And their responsibility as board members to review the policies that guide your library and make changes to them as needed. But that they cannot, have any extra power because they are an individual board member.
So moving on to your staff. So all staff in a library should understand that the library does have a responsibility to serve the entire community. We hope your staff also just understand the basics of intellectual freedom as it relates to library collections and services, and then what they should do if approached with a concern or complaint. And of course, this is going to change depending on whether you're a page or the manager of an area of the library. So it's really important if you have somebody at the circ desk who is approached, do they know what to say in that moment and who they might refer that person to if they are not authorized to really listen to the patron and follow through on next steps. And then if the library is going through a concern, who is authorized to speak publicly for the library about what is happening? And it's really, really important. We're going to be talking about a communication plan, and it's really, really important that this be covered so that everybody knows, no, if somebody walks in and is talking about that or asking questions, they know what they can say, they know who to refer people to. If there's a media call, who does that media call get referred to? There's a lot of elements of this that you want to make sure your staff know. And then we go on to staff who are actually responsible for doing that selection and weeding. So they need to know and follow the guidelines, criteria, and processes for material selection and evaluation. We talk a lot about, the library and the board is obligated to follow board approved policies and procedures. And I think people often think about that at the time of a complaint, but that applies to selection and evaluation and weeding as well for your staff. And then it's really important just to be able to talk about how and why library materials are chosen. To be able to say, we are striving to build a collection that serves the really wide-ranging needs and interests of everybody in our community, knowing that they can come to the library and have choices. Not every book is going to be appealing or a good fit for every patron, but we are confident that we have books that everybody coming into our library will find enjoyable. And then moving on to your community. So again, the library director and any staff who will be handling patron concerns need to be able to talk about reinforcing again how and why library materials are chosen and the role of choice in the library. That is such a fundamental aspect of what libraries do. It's about providing choices. It's about knowing that we are not buying every book for every person, but we are buying books so that every person can come into our library and find materials that will meet their needs and interests. And so these are things that you need to get comfortable talking about, and you need to practice talking about. And so when we get into the resources section, we're going to be sharing resources that we have used, some we've developed, some that are out there to help you get comfortable doing all of this. And here we go, right into that resource roundup. So What we are going to do is go through each area that we have just covered in kind of a whirlwind fashion, and show you that we have all the links in here. So here is that first section, why a policy, why do I need a policy? So we are linking you to the ALA Selection and Reconsideration Policy Toolkit, a reiteration that we have of why following that policy is really important, and the CCBC most important thing, the statutory and trustee information that Teresa talked about. All of these have invaluable things for you if you need to explain to a board member or anybody why this is so important to your library. And then resources for strong policies and procedures. So the first two, policy and procedure review activity, we've now mentioned that several times. It really includes checklists that you can go through, comparing your policy to those many elements that are ideally in a policy, those best practices. And then that CCBC what if Q&A on updating the request for reconsideration. It provides that example of a more transparent reconsideration policy or reconsideration form. Then the ALA Selection and Reconsideration Policy Toolkit, again, referring back to that, really helpful if you want another example of incorporating some of those best practices in. And then finally, Teresa has compiled some links to some sample policies from libraries in Wisconsin. If you want to take a look at how other libraries have navigated incorporating some of these elements into their policies and procedures, hopefully all of these elements into their policies and procedures. And then getting into communication resources. We mentioned that communication review activity. So we want you to, we take you through in that worksheet, thinking through, what have I done in terms of communication with our staff? Do they all understand that the library serves our entire community and how intellectual freedom really helps us do that? Then the trustee essentials. Talking about intellectual freedom is one of the Q&As we have on our website that give you some ideas for how to do this when you're talking to your staff or talking to members of the community. And then we have a practice activity on helping develop talking points in the context of your library and the work that you're doing. ALA has a great working with the media toolkit that talks about how you develop messaging and when that messaging is needed. So for example, somebody has posted on Facebook about a book that the library has and they are shocked. The library, ideally you have a communication plan that outlines who is responsible for responding to that, if you're going to respond to that, and what that messaging is going to be. Or there's a very public challenge going on and you get a call from the local media. The ALA working with the media toolkit really helps you think through those things. The response across the board is pretty consistent, and that is you are not at those points in time engaging about the material, you are informing about your process. You are saying, oh, we take concerns seriously, which is why we have a board approved process for addressing all concerns, and we are committed to following that. Teresa has shared that Beth Tomev, who is the Assistant Director of DPI Library Services team, she is available for consultation regarding crisis communications. I'm just going to add, I noticed the WLA Intellectual Freedom Special Interest Group, which is meeting this coming Monday, is having Beth as their guest speaker for that meeting. The Mead Public Library developed some talking points for their staff when they were going through a challenge several years ago, and they have given permission for us to share those. So we are sharing those with you. And then we've talked about the importance of practicing talking about the library and how and why library materials are chosen, the importance of serving your entire community and their many needs and interests, the importance of choice. That is really important to practice, not only just getting comfortable talking about those things in a conversational manner, but practicing in potential scenarios that might be similar to what you face. So we are sharing the role-playing scenarios that we have developed that we have been using when we do in-person workshops around the state, when we have people break into groups and really practice putting all of this together into action. And then finally, we wanted to talk, share some additional resources. So we have a slide deck that we developed called Preparing for and Responding to Challenges. Some of what it covers is included in what we just talked about, but then includes some additional things as well. The WLA has an intellectual freedom toolkit. It's really well organized and comprehensive and has links to many resources, including support for library staff, support for concerns about programs, and a lot of other things. And then we always want to make sure Wisconsin librarians are familiar with the work we do at the CCBC, providing timely and confidential information, consultation, and referral at the time you are facing a concern or a challenge. And it doesn't need to be a formal challenge or request for reconsideration has been filed. It can be something has happened that makes you think you just need a sounding board to talk about the situation. You need professional assessment information about the material in question. We are ready and willing and able to provide all of that to you in very efficiently and quickly, I will add. So now Tessa is going to take us through what she's seen coming up.
Yeah, but I'm going to turn my camera back on so that we can have this. It's a bit more of a dialogue in our final part of the webinar here. We did receive a couple questions and comments that I've had a couple of minutes to be thinking about since I was watching for them, but I'm going to throw them out to Teresa and Megan, and we can all add our perspectives on them. So they both relate to barriers or potential barriers. And so one question is regarding if a material is actively being challenged or reconsidered, are there issues with perhaps checking it out for yourself to be reading or reviewing so that you're more informed about that? How might that look if you are yourself the one who is making it inaccessible, yet at the same time you are reviewing it so that you are more informed about it? So thoughts about that aspect of a barrier?
Sure, I'll jump in on that. So I have two thoughts. In that sense, you are doing your job. I mean, obviously you have to read the book. So that is not making it inaccessible by checking it out to read it. But you could also see, hey, is it available? Can I request this from another library through interlibrary loans? So if you just sort of want to go, I'm going to show that our copy is still here, but there's nothing to say somebody else wouldn't have checked it out the next day anyway. So I wouldn't stress too much about that, as long as you are legitimately checking it out because you need to read it as part of the process of responding to this concern or complaint. What do you think, Teresa and Tessa?
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Megan. Especially in small places, you're not going to own more than one copy of some of these titles, and you do need to make an informed decision. And maybe some of your board members want to actually, whoever's involved, not necessarily board members, but whatever staff are involved in doing the review, would want to be familiar with what they're doing. So, having a blanket policy that something will be sequestered until it has been reviewed is absolutely not okay. But practically using the material, either checking it out to yourself or loaning it out in the community is just the way library material is typically used. So proceed as you normally would.
I'm just going to add that I think we are so lucky in Wisconsin that we have such a rich interlibrary loan service, and that you can quickly see how many other libraries have this particular material. And that actually might be something you just want to check out anyway, so that you have that in your understanding of, wow, no one else has this. Maybe this is something we really want to be thinking of, or wow, this book is really common and I can get it in loads of libraries within even our own system here. So I think it is helpful to kind of get that perspective right away just by checking to see where else could I get this book within Wisconsin. So hopefully that those responses helped with that question there. The next question, there's actually two that are related, and they are about who can challenge a material. Do you need to be a library card holder? Do you have to have an active library card? Do you need to be part of that community? Do you need to identify that on the form? How do you handle that? Can someone who doesn't even live in your library community challenge a book or any material, I guess, for that matter?
So this gets into that slide where we were talking about potential barriers. So I understand, I totally understand that sort of both pragmatically and given what has happened in recent years, there's a temptation to go, we're going to put these limits on who can challenge. The library card holder limit would ignore that. You are literally funded to serve everybody in your community, whether they have a library card or not. So that's really, really important to keep in mind. But even beyond this, and I want to thank Tessa for like helping me think this through. Think about communities that have a large tourism industry. You have people using your libraries. I use the Door County Library System all the time when I go up there. Am I not entitled to ask questions or raise a formal concern as a user of that library because I don't live there or have a card? I would like to think that I can. And so I think that's really, really important. And just remembering that, again, we don't want to apply those principles of intellectual freedom selectively. Teresa and Tessa, what do you think?
Well, I'm going to just chime in and add on to that your library says that you're a public library, so you are open to the public, and I think that's something you just want to ground your response in. I have seen different forms are written into policies and procedures, acknowledging. I think that you can ask it as a matter of fact question, like, are you an act, what is your address, or are you a library user? You can have things like that, or emphasize that we're gonna give a weighted response to active users of our community. I know that you don't want to get too tight with all of those things because you don't want to get yourself into a corner. You do want to make sure that you're being as transparent as possible. But I think it does come down to you are a public library. And I think we are always tend to come to challenges or reconsideration from a defensive point. Someone might find something in your library that you didn't even realize was there, had just missed reading, and you might be really grateful to say, I'm so glad you found that really outdated book because you happen to be visiting our town and are doing some genealogy work and found this resource that, yeah, maybe we do want to reconsider this. So again, just trying to keep an open mind about that. Sorry, Teresa, I took a lot of bandwidth there.
No, it's okay. I won't add much. I just want to say that, I understand the instinct to want to put some constraints on this because practically speaking, we've seen what happens when someone arrives with a list of 400 titles. But the reality is if someone is determined to challenge something in your library, even if you had one of those limits, they're going to find a local resident to do it for them. They're going to find a way around. The best approach is to approach every challenge as openly and transparently as you can and just accept what comes your way and deal with it. And as Megan mentioned earlier, you can put some stopgaps on the workload by including in your policy, the fact that your board or your committee may only have time to review 2 titles a month or something like that. Because you just can't spend all day, every day reviewing challenge requests. You can, put in, we're only going to review a material. Once a material or a title has gone through the review process, we're not going to address it again for a certain length of time to prevent people from just repeatedly throwing paperwork at you. But, they're going to work around any kind of weird limits that you try to put in. Not that residency would be a weird limit, but I think you know what I'm saying.
I'll just add, and we talk about this I believe in the updating the request for reconsideration form. What you can do that I think is really valid is as part of that process, say, we want to hear what the concern is in your own words. So,
yes,
you have to be able to articulate. I'll throw out another barrier I've heard that makes me really uncomfortable, and that is that if the person hasn't read the entire book, the challenge isn't valid. I'm really concerned about that as an element in a policy, because I think we all know that in selection, we can't possibly read every book that we're selecting. And so I just think it's really important to not put up barriers that make no sense, because we understand the work we do demands that we make informed professional choices based on professional reviews and other things. And from their point of view, if they are getting that information from a third party or based on the portion of that book they read, they are also getting informed choices. They're just different informed choices than we use in our professional work selecting materials.
And again, I'm just going to say, don't underestimate the importance of that informal conversation before you even get to trying to bring the conversation back. Could we sit down and talk about this first? That might maybe go from 12 titles to 4. You just don't know. So I'm going to say with our remaining 5 minutes, we have 2 questions that I think we can get in there. But Megan, if you could advance to our final slide, because I just want to make sure that folks know you can reach out to us directly, or both of us, all of us, because we know that there might be things that are percolating right now. And after you look through the resources, you might have more questions. So just know you have our emails there. So one of the questions was regarding the communication in part 3 about what do you do for a circulation desk attendant if the complaint, because that's often the first person that will receive anything from the public is right there. So what's the suggestion for a response for them? And what happens if the idea to go to the director and the director is not there at that moment?
Sure. I think that's first of all, I also saw that question in the chat, and I want to first acknowledge, because the person noticed that part 3 was really short. I want to say when we have done these workshops in person, part 3 is all of the hands-on practice work we do in those workshops. And so, this webinar in this format and this time frame just didn't allow us to really expand on all that. So you have time practicing and role playing. I think, first of all, the protocols will depend on individual libraries. So, what is your sort of your hierarchy of, if it's a very small library and it's the CERC staff and the director, then I think it's really important that CERC staff be really clear on, first of all, be really clear on what the parameters are, be really comfortable, be given the opportunity to practice what it is you want them to say. So, thank you so much for bringing that concern to me. I am not authorized, or I am not the person who can respond to your concern, but I will take down your information. Our director is not here right now, but I will make sure they get this as soon as they return. I mean, there's really, I don't think a lot more that you can do than that, other than to empower that person to help them feel really comfortable when they have to have those encounters. What do you two think?
I think that's it.
Yeah. And I know there are more that tie into this topic in the resources shared from, as Megan said, a lot of our other sessions that we've done about that. I'm going to go to our last question, which I think we can answer, and it's a 2-part. And that's, should the actual reconsideration form be approved by the board, or is the form part of a procedure? So that's kind of a technical question. And then the part 2 is, can you talk more about how a reconsideration form is considered a public record?
And I can take this one if that's okay. So the reconsideration form, I think it would be best to have your board review it, because this is such a contentious issue. I think there's a case that could be made that it is a procedure, but I would be more comfortable as a library director having my board review not just the policy, but the form as well, and explaining to the board why each element is on it, so that they have a background in understanding how your library will respond to those requests. In terms of the public record, there is a general record schedule for public libraries and public library systems in the state. I think almost all libraries in the state have adopted that schedule. That schedule specifically states that reconsideration forms are public records, subject to retention and subject to the open records laws. You may be able to redact some personal identifiable information from that form when you release it, but the idea here is that a member of the public is asking government officials, you as the library director or the library board, to take an action that may affect the whole community, and the community has the right to see that record. So those are open records. You may not name those as, I've seen some policies in the past, I think most of these are getting corrected now, that state that they would be kept confidential. You cannot do that. You cannot opt a record out of the open records law by simply stating that they're confidential. You would have to make that determination on a case-by-case basis. If there is something confidential within the record, you could possibly redact it, but the record itself is a public record.
And I think that brings us to the end of the questions that we've received in the chat and the Q&A. Thank you so much for the live responses, Megan and Teresa. I hope that those were helpful to attendees, and I hope that everyone will enjoy the resources both in the slides and in the many links that are provided. Thank you so much for hosting this webinar, Sui. Lori?
Thank you. Thank you to our
Bronstein?
Thank you to our presenters for providing the valuable information. And as was noted, you will receive an email with the link to the slides and recording. So you'll be able to view that afterwards. So thank you for everybody for attending, and I hope you have a good rest of the day and the rest of the week. Bye.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.